Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Reading Corner. I'm so happy you're here, and I've got some really fun stories to read to you today. I don't know who here has heard of the Little Mr. Men and Little Miss books. So I'm going to be reading from them Mr. Bounce and then Little Miss Chatterbox and Mr. Strong. And I think you're going to really enjoy these stories. They've got some great pictures and some great fun things that happen. So we're going to start with Mr. Bounce. And he's a tiny little guy. And guess what happens to him? Yep, he bounces. Mr. Bounce was very small and like a rubber ball. He just couldn't keep himself on the ground. He bounced all over the place. And as you can imagine, that made things rather difficult. Last week, for instance, Mr. Bounce was out walking when he came to a farm. He climbed over the farm gate, and you can guess what happened next, can't you? He jumped down from the gate and bounced right into the duck pond. Bounce went Mr. Bounce. Splash went Mr. Bounce. Quack went the ducks. The other morning, for instance, Mr. Bounce was in bed. He woke up and jumped out of bed, and you can guess what happened next, can't you? He bounced right out of his bedroom door and all the way downstairs. Bounce, 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 bounce. That happens quite often, which probably explains why Mr. Bounce leaves his bedroom door open every night. After he had picked himself up, Mr. Bounce went inside his house and sat down to think. Bounce. Mr. Bounce bounced off the chair and banged his head on the ceiling. Bang went Mr. Bounce's head on the ceiling. Ouch, said Mr. Bounce. This is ridiculous, Mr. Bounce thought to himself, rubbing his head. I must do something to stop all this bouncing about. He thought and thought. I know, he thought, I'll go and see the doctor. So after breakfast, Mr. Bounce set off to the nearest town to see the doctor. He was passing a tennis court when he tripped over a pebble. Bounce, he bounced, and he bounced right onto the court where two children were playing tennis. And you can guess what happened next, can't you? The children didn't realize that Mr. Bounce wasn't a tennis ball, and they started hitting him with their tennis rackets backwards and forwards over the net. Bounce, ooh, bounce, ow, bounce, ouch. Oh, Mr. Bounce. Eventually, one of the children hit Mr. Bounce so hard, he bounced right out of the tennis court. Mr. Bounce bounced off down the road towards the town. Oh dear, he said, feeling very sorry for himself. I've been bounced black and blue. A bus was coming down the road, and Mr. Bounce decided that the safest place for him would be on it. He got on and sat down, still feeling more than a little sorry for himself. The bus drove into town. The bus stopped right outside the doctor's. Mr. Bounce stepped down from the bus. And you can guess what happened next, can't you? He didn't step down onto the pavement outside the doctor's. Oh no, not Mr. Bounce. He stepped off the bus and onto the pavement and bounced in through the doctor's window. Dr. Makewell was sitting at his desk, enjoying his mid-morning cup of coffee. Mr. Bounce sailed through the open window and landed. Well, you can guess where he landed, can't you? That's right. Splash went the coffee. Ouch, squeaked Mr. Bounce. The coffee was rather hot. Good heavens, exclaimed Dr. Makewell. After the doctor had fished Mr. Bounce out of his coffee and sat him on some blotting paper to dry out, he listened to what Mr. Bounce had to tell him. So you see, said Mr. Bounce finally, you must give me something to stop me bouncing about all over the place quite so much. Pondered the doctor. After some thought, Dr. Makewell went to his medicine cabinet and took out a pair of tiny red boots. This should do the trick, he told Mr. Bounce. Heavy boots. That should stop the bouncing. Oh, thank you, Dr. Makewell, said Mr. Bounce, and walked home wearing his red boots. Not bounced, walked. That night, Mr. Bounce went to bed wearing his heavy boots, and then he went to sleep. The following morning, he woke up and yawned and stretched and bounced out of bed. And can you guess what happened next? No, he didn't bounce down the stairs. He went straight through the bedroom floorboards and finished up in the kitchen. Poor Mr. Bounce. Quite a complicated life being so bouncy, I'd imagine. So now we're going to read all about another little miss called Little Miss Chatterbox. Little Miss Chatterbox talked more than a lot. She talked all the time, day in and day out, week after week, month after month, year in and year out. She never stopped. She didn't know it, but she even talked in her sleep. She had a brother. I bet you can guess what his name was, can't you? That's right, Mr. Chatterbox. She looks a bit like him, don't you think? You should have heard them when they got together. He couldn't get a word in edgewise, or sideways, or anyways. Have you ever heard about somebody being able to talk the hind leg off a donkey? Well, Mr. Chatterbox could talk both hind legs off a donkey, and his sister could talk the hind leg off an elephant. Now, this story is about the time Little Miss Chatterbox decided to get herself a job, which she did, in a bank in Happyland. At 10 o'clock one Monday morning, Mr. Happy strolled into the Happy to Lend You bank in the middle of Happy Town. He took out his checkbook, wrote a check, and went to the counter. Behind the counter, on her first morning at work, stood Little Miss Chatterbox. She smiled at Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy smiled back. Good morning, he said cheerfully. Well, said Little Miss Chatterbox, taking a deep breath. For the time of year, it is a good morning, but not as good as the morning we had yesterday. And I dare say tomorrow morning will be an even better morning, but it's quite a good morning for a Monday morning. And she went on and on and on until it was time for the bank to shut. Mr. Happy was still standing there with his mouth open in amazement. He had been there for hours. And now, continued Little Miss Chatterbox, it is time for the bank to shut and time for me to go home. So goodbye and nice talking to you. And she went home, leaving poor Mr. Happy without any money. The following morning, she was fired. She got herself another job in a restaurant, the Eat-A-Lot. It was Tuesday morning, and at midday, Mr. Greedy walked into the restaurant and sat himself down at his usual corner table. He always ate there on Tuesdays because that was the day they served extra large portions. The waitress came up to take his order. What's the soup of the day, Mr. Greedy? Asked the waitress. Well, said Little Miss Chatterbox, for she was the waitress, the soup of the day is tomato, but we also have other soups on the menu, such as oxtail and vegetable and chicken noodle, but we have lots of other things to start with, such as... And she went on and on and on until midnight. Mr. Greedy was still sitting there listening in amazement. He'd been there for 12 hours listening. And now, continued Little Miss Chatterbox, it is time for the Eat-A-Lot restaurant to shut and for me to go home. So goodbye and nice talking to you. And she went home, leaving poor Mr. Greedy feeling rather empty. The next morning, she was fired. The same thing happened all week long. On Thursday morning, she was fired from her job as an assistant in a hat shop. Miss Splendid went into the shop to buy herself a new hat, but she couldn't. Oh, madam, I've just the hat for you, and I know you're going to love it because it's pink and pink is your colour, and it was all talk and no hat. On Friday morning, she was fired from her job as a secretary to Mr. Uppity. Mr. Uppity, incidentally, was the richest man in the world. I just thought you'd like to know. But poor Mr. Uppity didn't make any money the day that Little Miss Chatterbox was working for him. Oh, no. Oh, Mr. Uppity, I've never worked in an office before, and isn't it exciting? And would you like a cup of coffee? And are you as rich as everybody says you are? And it was all talk and no work. But this story has a happy ending because at the very end of that week, Little Miss Chatterbox managed to find herself a job that suited her down to the ground and up to the sky. That Saturday evening, Mr. Chatterbox was at home in Chatterbox Cottage, which was where he lived. Mr. Chatterbox was cross because his watch had stopped, and he had arranged to meet Little Miss Sunshine at 7 o'clock, and he had no idea what the time was. So he decided to telephone the speaking clock to find out what time it was. He dialed the number. At the third stroke, it will be 6:25 and 15 seconds. Little Miss Chatterbox took a deep breath. Hip, hip, hip. At the third stroke, it will be 6:25 and 20 seconds. Hip, hip, hip. That's funny, thought Mr. Chatterbox to himself. That sounds just like my sister. The end. So Little Miss Chatterbox got a job where she could talk all day long and it didn't stop anybody else from eating or shopping or banking or anything. So I think that worked out well for everybody. Now, our final story today is Mr. Strong. This is the story of Mr. Strong. Mr. Strong is the strongest person in the whole wide world. The strongest person there ever has been and probably the strongest person there ever will be. He is so strong, he can not only bend an iron bar with his bare hands, he can tie knots in it. Mr. Strong is so strong, he can throw a cannonball as far as you or I can throw a tennis ball. Mr. Strong is so strong, he can hammer nails into a wall just by tapping them with his finger. Strong by name and strong by nature. And would you like to know the secret of Mr. Strong's strength? Eggs. The more eggs Mr. Strong eats, the stronger he becomes. Stronger and stronger and stronger. Anyway, this story is about a funny thing that happened to Mr. Strong one day. That morning, he was having breakfast. And for breakfast, he was having eggs, followed by eggs. And to finish, he was having, guess what? That's right, eggs. That was Mr. Strong's normal breakfast. After his eggy breakfast, Mr. Strong cleaned his teeth. And as usual, he squeezed all the toothpaste out of the tube. And as usual, he cleaned his teeth so hard he broke his toothbrush. Mr. Strong gets through a lot of toothpaste and a lot of toothbrushes. After that, he decided to take a walk, put on his hat and opened the front door of his house. Crash! What a beautiful day, he thought to himself, and stepping outside his house, he shut his front door. Bang! The door fell off its hinges. Mr. Strong gets through a lot of front doors. Then Mr. Strong went for his walk. He walked through the woods, but he wasn't looking where he was going and walked slap bang into a huge tree. Crack! The huge tree trunk snapped and the tree thundered to the ground. Whoops, said Mr. Strong. He walked into town and again, not looking where he was going, he walked slap bang straight into a bus. Now, as you know, if you or I were to walk into a bus, we'd get run over, wouldn't we? Not Mr. Strong. The bus stopped as if it had run into a brick wall. Whoops, said Mr. Strong. Eventually, Mr. Strong walked through the town and out into the country to a farm. The farmer met him in the road looking very worried. What's the matter? Asked Mr. Strong. It's my cornfield, replied the farmer. It's on fire and I can't put it out. Mr. Strong looked over the hedge and sure enough, the cornfield was blazing fiercely. Water, said Mr. Strong. We must get water to put out the fire. But I don't have enough water to put out a whole field, cried the worried farmer, and the nearest water is down at the river and I don't have a pump. Then we'll have to find something to carry the water, replied Mr. Strong. Is that your barn? He asked the farmer, pointing to a barn in another field. Yes, I was going to put my corn in it, said the farmer, but can I use it? Asked Mr. Strong. Yes, but, replied the perplexed farmer. Mr. Strong walked over to the barn and then, do you know what he did? He picked it up. He actually picked up the barn. The farmer couldn't believe his eyes. Then Mr. Strong carried the barn above his head down to the river. Then he turned the barn upside down. Then he lowered it into the river so that it filled up with water. Then, and this shows how strong Mr. Strong is, he picked it up and carried it back to the blazing cornfield. Mr. Strong emptied the upside-down barn full of water over the flames. Sizzle, sizzle, splutter, splutter. 1 minute, the flames were leaping into the air. The next minute, they'd gone. How ever can I thank you? The farmer asked Mr. Strong. Oh, it was nothing, remarked Mr. Strong modestly. But I must find some way to reward you, said the farmer. Well, said Mr. Strong, you're a farmer, so you must keep chickens. Yes, lots, said the farmer. And chickens lay eggs, went on Mr. Strong, and I rather like eggs. Then you shall have as many eggs as you can carry, said the farmer, and took Mr. Strong over to the farmyard. Mr. Strong said goodbye to the farmer and thanked him for the eggs, and the farmer thanked him for helping. Then Mr. Strong, just using one finger, picked up the basket of eggs and went home. Mr. Strong put the eggs carefully down on his kitchen table and went to close the kitchen door. Crash! The door fell off its hinges. Whoops, said Mr. Strong, and sat down. Crunch! The chair fell to bits. Whoops, said Mr. Strong, and started cooking his lunch. And for lunch, he was starting with eggs, followed by an egg or two, and then eggs. And then for his pudding, he was having, well, can you guess? If you can, there's no need to turn this page over to find out that he was having ice cream. Surprise. We all like ice cream sometimes, don't we? I really hope that you enjoyed those books, and I've got lots more books coming up next time. I'm looking forward to reading again to you. And yeah, I just am so happy that you're here, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. So bye for now.